G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic start to your week. Now I didn't mention it yesterday, but this week I actually start my chemotherapy again. Of course, after a few weeks off because of how sick that I got. Now I was actually meant to start this morning, but I had the drugs and last night I was just, I guess if you could say, in the mood, but I was in the mood to get it done more quickly. So I started last night. Today is day 2. I'll be finishing up this time Thursday evening. So this week, guys, you're just going to have to bear with me. Maybe the videos will be shorter, maybe some of my thinking, maybe a little bit less critical. Remember that this is attacking my brain of all places as well. There will be some days where we miss videos and I apologize for that, but we've got to do what we've got to do. Now, legends, of course, as always, there is a lot to go over. We will be looking at the maps, a couple of geolocations, compare the maps, see where things are moving. We need to talk about some comments Trump has made about Crimea. There's also been a lip reader come out with what they believe was said between Zelensky and Trump. And we'll look at what Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has said. Also, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergey Lavrov, he has done an interview with CBS. We'll go over that because that gives us a better idea of where Russia is sitting in this ceasefire negotiating process. But where I want to start is I want to talk about low footprint vehicles, motorcycles, ATVs, quads, scooters, all of that, because it's very funny to see it become, like many, many other tactics, a piss take at one point through to then an accepted tactic at the end. Cope cage, brilliant one of this, oh, that's silly, blah, 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 to now we see every armoured vehicle with some level of cope cage, even if it is a Merkava tank in the IDF. Okay, so let's talk about this. Now, this bit of footage here got me thinking specifically about this. Now, this is Russian forces said to be VDV on quad bikes in Sumy Oblast. Now, I'm not going to show you this footage, but they are moving to the left to right of your screen. They hit a mine and are both taken out. Now, sadists who are sitting in their basements, they will laugh and edit this footage and make it seem how they want it to seem. But this is showing how this war is evolving, and I want to talk about this. But what isn't being mentioned on this footage, before we get into the use of these and the tactic, is actually the geolocation of where these guys got hit. So let me show you on the map. Here is Ukraine in the center of your screen. And of course, we have Sumy Oblast and Kursk. Of course, where Ukraine, they likely hold a small sliver in Kursk, but nowhere near what was once held and what was once heralded as the savior for the remainder of the occupied territory. And then we see where Russia has crossed into Sumy, Novenki, Basivkia, Zoravka, and then I want to bring your eyes to this Lochnia. Now, down in here, this is where Suryak talk, there has been Russian operations leading out into here. And that footage I showed you where those two guys got hit, let's have a look at the geoloc. Lochnia and just to the west of here. Now, that's not being discussed. And this is at a very minimum from this point here, 5 kilometres behind the border, or about 3 from where the grey zone on this is. So what we get is the Russians are working a fair bit further behind the line there. And this comes to the use of vehicles like these fast, manoeuvrable motorcycles or ATVs. So we see then this, and Mr. Rob Lee, he shares this of Ukraine's 58th Motorised Brigade training on these motorcycles and quads, which is no surprise at all in this war. But I want to bring your attention to something which I screenshotted, I saved in my Google Drive back in October the 14th, I think rightfully named Age Well. And it is this post here from one of the largest bloggers in the game. I don't know who in Russia came up with the idea to use motorcycles for assaults, but I want to personally thank him. It's the dumbest idea on the planet. It didn't end well for these two guys. And this was posted in June 9th, 2024. And when I saw that, I thought, I bet I will use this at some point. And now we're seeing, of course, this as the evolution of tactics in a protracted, extended, attritional war, where landmines are everywhere. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So when Russia uses light vehicles like motorcycles, it's a sign of weakness, but when Ukraine uses them, it's suddenly a sign of strength. It feels like we're dealing with the Schrodinger's light vehicles. And this is upon many, many different things that we see, and borrowing tactics and changing of war and evolution of items at the front line. We went back in wars from horses to tanks, and then in some wars back to very light movements again. So let's talk about motorcycles, and why am I speaking of this, and what I guess is my experience of this? Well, let's have a look at the Australian Army for then heavily armoured vehicles such as this Boxer, and look at what these two guys in front of the military might be on. And I think you will see that all then elite forces around the world, from the Aussies to the Yanks to the Brits, are then incorporating items like this for reconnaissance and different sorts of missions, from sniping to working with armoured or motorised vehicles like this. So this is the opinion that I'm speaking on, as someone who was there and has been in the military industrial complex, seeing the deals getting put forward to try and bring these into the fold, because there's a real place for them. Now, to relate back to the footage that we see, one mistake, and often this is done on purpose because this is propaganda, is a lot of pages or bloggers, they will only show you the unsuccessful attacks like this. Now, because of this, their followers end up believing that every attack goes the same way and that it is always a failure. But what we see on the maps is that continuing to move, which we know, well, then it can't all be a failure of attack. And what this does, by just presenting that, it creates a pseudo-environment, to quote Walter Lippmann, I think it's a fantastic term, pseudo-environment, that it becomes the truth where it may not be. But those who are just taking in that part, it becomes their truth in this pseudo-environment because it's being shown one side. That's why many people are starting to come to the realisation of, well, how is the front still moving? Okay? Now, from the perspective of an infantryman, and I've seen that bikes and quads, in my opinion, make complete sense in this war. I'm actually surprised we don't see more of it. They have a much smaller footprint on the ground. They have two wheels and they are significantly lighter. They have a significantly reduced IR heat signature compared to something like a tank or a much larger armoured vehicle. Remember, that armour, that heats up too and takes a long time to cool off, and it's massive. You can't just lie it down either. They are much harder to spot and hit, and they drastically reduce the risk of having a mass casualty event. One drone, they can take out a vehicle, BMP, M113, whatever, carrying 10 dudes. A quad, a bike might carry one or two guys, and it's much more difficult to strike. So you have, 10 guys on 10 bikes or 10 guys in one vehicle, you're going to need 10 drones or 10 mines to hit, rather than spreading those forces out. It makes complete sense to me. Now, terrain in this war is another major factor. In many areas, conditions have become impossible for wheeled or tracked vehicles to move, especially at speed, not just from environmental factors, but also just things like where shells have exploded. Drive your car through a muddy paddock versus riding a dirt bike through it. There's a reason why farmers use dirt bikes for speed and tractors to move mass, and you can apply that to armoured vehicles, trucks, and motorcycles. Now, motorcycles, they offer far better flexibility for evasive manoeuvres, quicker dismounts, and faster dispersal under fire, and these are critical advantages where every second counts. But this is just the natural evolution of weapons involved in war. As larger weapon systems are lost or used up, this idea of Russia will run out of tanks on X date and then we will win is a fantasy for many. But as the battlefield adapts, whether by force or necessity, maybe it is by force of less of those tanks being available and having to shift your tactics, or the necessity of, hey, tanks on the battlefield with FPV drones are just far more dangerous, we just see the battlefield changing. And smaller, faster, cheaper platforms and tactics around them will start to dominate. That's why we're seeing both sides do this. Now, Russia and Ukraine are currently using these in vastly different ways. But this is also just due to the different states of their war. Russia is assaulting, moving forwards. Ukraine is defending. So yes, we see them used in different ways. Same as we see armoured vehicles used in different ways. But then you look back at when Ukraine has been on the offensive versus when Russia is on the offensive, and you start to draw parallels between this. I guarantee you, if we ever see the roles reversed, Ukraine back on large offensive actions, we will see the very same. Now, the biggest issue I see for the Russian crusty demons, the crusty Ivans, is their spacing, that they are often way too close to each other, and one mine or one explosion takes out multiple of them. Spacing in warfare is critical, but also very, very difficult, especially moving at speed. Now, most often, these are recon groups, not the forward line of the main assault. They're either working between lines, moving elements, or behind the lines for reconnaissance. Don't get me wrong, this is an incredibly dangerous gig, and the footage backs this up. They're likely carrying things like ammunition, or two up with a medic or a forward observer to call in artillery to get to those positions if they're working between lines more quickly. Or if they're behind the line, they will be a smaller assault force, not to attack Ukraine's main position, but to attack that forward, less defended position so they can gain that for then the main assault to move forwards. This is what we see of, this is the whole idea behind combined arms maneuver warfare, or just combined arms warfare, is multiple elements in one. And there may be cases where it's just, yep, we'll go that way, boys on the bikes. But if you just think that is where all the command boils down to, you're going to end up like a lot of these pages who are asking how and why, when we continue to see the front line moving forward, although all the footage that they are seeing is just these guys getting bombs dropped on them. So I guess my conclusion here, and I've shared this with you before, probably 6 to 12 months ago, that a SOF member working in Ukraine said to me, we mowed down these dudes on bikes. But that said, none of us would have had the morale right now to storm into those positions on the motorcycles. And that to me said a lot about the psychological state at that area, at least he was on. Now, ask yourself, you're on the battlefield, okay? You are about to conduct an assault into an area. Would you rather ride on a motorcycle into that assault, dismount quickly and maneuver more quickly, or a slow, grinding BMP, M113, something like that, with 10 of you in the back moving forward with what we have seen and the devastation that drones and mines can have? I would rather go on the numbers approach. So we will see way more motorcycles enter this war, and with that we will see far more losses. But is it the dumbest tactic ever developed? Absolutely not. Otherwise, militaries around the world will not be spending billions of dollars looking to implement then electric or motorcycles with then armoured and motorised elements for everything from recon to long-range strike, anti-armour, sniping missions. Right, so let's have a quick look at the maps. Let's look where things are moving. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, there is only one section of red check on this, and remember that red check on this map confirms where the Russian forces have moved. And this is showing that the Russian forces, they have then occupied this town here, this Nadezhdienka, on, I call this whole area then the Pokrovsk front line. But we do have a lot of other movements here to show you. But we don't have this being confirmed today by Suryak. But what we did have is over the past few days, Suryak showing movements in these exact areas. So given our threshold, we can confirm that movement. But let's just come to the south of here, and this is where we come to the Rozliv front, or Constantinople front. So let's bring up Suryak map, because he's telling a fairly different story down in this direction. So we'll just zoom in on this a little bit. Now, this red dot, this is Rozliv. This red dot is Constantinople. So by Suryak's map, he is showing that Constantinople and Andreevka up here, this is the red dot here, both have come under complete occupation by the Russian forces, and this road running through the center is here, that they are running down where this creek line runs, down into Rozliv and right along here. So I won't draw it in for you, but you get an idea of where my cursor is moving. So it is significantly different between where these maps are to somewhat of maybe 3 kilometers this way and about maybe the same as well. So I guess we will see. But as this slows down or maybe increases, we will get a better idea of where things are sitting as well. Eventually, we get more geolocations coming out, showing where there is definitely some movement. So we'll move up Pokrovsk, and then we'll move into the east of Pokrovsk and the Tatasivkia front here. And there's been some confirmation as well on where Suryak was incorrect, where there still is grey zone. So let's zoom in on this. And this is Tatasivkia. So of course, they did know there was some pushback that the northern areas are still controlled by Ukraine, but the majority of Tatasivkia, according to Suryak, has come under the control of the Russian forces, as well as this tree line out in this sector as well coming under. But where I want to look is then to the north of this Yelizaveta in here. Now, this area is said to be still under grey zone by Suryak, so confirming the map on this. But also this northern movement to here out from the west. And if we look where these paddocks are, it's right up to where this tree line is and sort of through here. So going on the northern flank of this area and a small envelopment. Again, that is how we have seen Russia fight again and again. I pull up, there's been a very big blogger at the moment say Russia's new, he called it the new horseshoe tactic. And my thing is, if you've got 1 million followers, almost, and you're saying that Russia has this new tactic of enveloping areas because, as he put it, they were too scared to fight straight up the guts. Where the fuck have you been? Okay? It's not about being too scared. It's about legitimate military tactics and reducing losses in attritional style warfare. So then we will look at Toretsk in here, and we can see some just minor movements. So we're looking for where this, I call it the fish hook in here. So just up in here that said Russia has gained more areas, and there was an attack out to the northwest, but Ukraine did push that backwards. Now, just what's in my brain, some Russian pages, they are claiming that there has been some groups cross the Dnieper River into Kherson. Again, I've seen nothing to actually back that up, so take that with an almighty grain of salt, but it's worth just mentioning in case we see it. And then we see Chasiv Yar. We're looking for Stepuchki in here. Now again, Chasiv Yar, very little movement in here, but very, very important. And what we're looking for is Stepochki. And we can see Stepochki right here. This is this red dot that there has been, by Suryak at least, movement right out into here, right in line with then this. I'm guessing this is a reservoir down in here or spoil. So right from the front line here, probably about 3 kilometers if we go back, 2.5 kilometers, which tends to be the movements out from the map where these then disagree. So keep an eye on that. Chasiv Yar, the amount of fighting in here has been absolutely massive. Let's move up into our last update into then the Cherny front. Now, no changes shown on here, but for a period, there was some fairly quick movements. So Novy is the area we are looking for first. We'll bring up then the Suryak maps, and he is showing that Novy is really getting encircled at the moment with further movement across then this road and down to the south. And then we continue pushing down south, and we're looking for this Kolodyazy, and he claims the Russians have entered the first houses of Kolodyazy, and you can see just the different shape in where these front lines are sitting. So I guess wait out on that. We'll see what geolocations come forward, and just some movement in the northern area as well, just about, excuse me, just where my cursor is at the moment. See this paddock coming down in this angle? This is right in here. So again, it's probably that, let's go from here to here, about that 3 kilometer difference. So again, wait and see. We'll wait for confirmations. Our threshold on confirming map movements is far higher than a lot of others, both ways. So wait and see. Hopefully we get some geolocations to confirm. But I think that a lot of maps are going to be stuck with their thumb up their ass if there is a ceasefire, because then it's going to be very difficult to hide where the line actually sits. And I believe there may be errors up to the hundreds of square kilometers, or across the entire front line, talking over 1,000 kilometer front line, it could be a lot. Okay, so let's look at some bits and pieces of, I guess, diplomacy, if you want to call it. Now, The Sun, they had a lip reader talk about this meeting here. Now, what we see is that Macron and Zelensky, they catch up like old buddies, high fives, hugs, hand shandies, the whole bit. And Macron, it does look like from the footage, it does appear to not want to shake or not put out his hand to shake Trump's hand in greeting. Okay, whatever. Now, The Sun, their lip reader has said that he says to Macron, Trump says, you are not in the right here. I need you to do me a favour. You should not be here. Originally, there was 3 seats. Macron fucking pisses off, and then there are 2 seats, Zelensky and Trump. Zelensky nods in agreement, and the vicar, who is in front of the camera, turns his head to the side while looking worried at what he has heard between them. Now, Hickling, who is the lip reader here, he's analysed this footage from Zelensky and Trump's mini-peace summit. According to himself, the Ukrainian president said, I would like you to do that, but not this way. We're thinking referring to peace or minerals deal, and Trump replies, it's a very interesting strategy. You have reassurance. So how much can we pull out of that? Really not much, but we can see Macron's attitude towards Trump, not quite there. And I did miss it yesterday, and I'll speak on it again. I think a lot of people were underdressed for the Pope's funeral. One of the most prestigious events is being at the Pope's funeral. A lot of people in blue suits, or Zelensky still dressed better than usual, but still not in a suit or in proper suit shoes. As you know, I see this all as a sign of respect, and I think that Trump was underdressed in a blue suit as well, but he was not the only one like that. Biden was too. Now, Crimea. I think realistically, however this war goes, and I'm meaning literally however this war goes, I believe Crimea will remain under Russian control. Will it be de jure, de facto? I don't know. I think it's very likely going to be de jure, not de facto. But even if Ukraine get all the weapons supplied with their manpower, I think an attack on Crimea would jeopardize everything else. We saw Kursk. We saw this minor operation into a very lightly defended area such as Kursk. We saw how that jeopardized movements on the east for months. Imagine the movement into a highly, highly, highly defendable area where there's really 2 ways. And if you start speaking to me about paratroopers or amphibious landings, where we'll see how an amphibious landing goes for the Chinese. Thing is, they probably have the numbers to do that. Para landings, fucking okay, boys, go and join the army and see how that actually is going to work out in a heavily AD environment, heavily defended environment. Soft para still exists, but large, jumping out the door at 1,000 feet into an area like that without supply, it's not World War II. But I believe Crimea will likely remain under at least Russian control, or as Trump has put, it'll become part of Russia. Let's listen to this part.
Zelensky ready to give up Crimea? Do you think, Mr. President?
Is Zelensky ready to give up Crimea?
I think so, yeah. Look, Crimea was 12 years ago. That was President Obama. They gave it up without a shot being fired. So don't talk to me about Crimea. Talk to Obama and Biden about Crimea. I was just wondering what Zelensky thought. And remember, this is Biden's war.
Lavrov asks, well, why don't you ask me about Trump's position on Crimea? Brennan says, well, President Trump said Crimea is not even being discussed right now. And Lavrov says, yes, because this is a done deal. You mean Russia occupies, controls, and will not negotiate the future of Crimea? Is that what you're saying? And Lavrov says Russia does not negotiate its own territory. So again, usual rhetoric of this is Biden's war. Now what I will say is, no, the US, they have come in as an actor in this war. It is, regardless of who it is, you've inherited this, but it does need to be noted too, regardless of what you think of Trump, it's not like he inherited a winning war either. And I've said, I believe history may show Trump as saving Ukraine, not betraying Ukraine. Now let's look at what Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said on NBC.
Given the frustrations that he is voicing, Mr. Secretary, why hasn't he imposed sanctions yet?
Trump sanctions on Russia.
Well, because I think we're still hoping to see that this effort works out in diplomacy and that we can bring these two sides closer together. I mean, the minute you start doing that kind of stuff, you're walking away from it. You've now doomed yourself to another 2 years of war, and we don't want to see it happen. I think what's important and really ways is there is no other country.
So it goes over. look, if we just start imposing more sanctions, we're trying to bring an end to this. And realistically, there's going to need to have incentives as well. People don't like that, but the stick's not working. You're going to have to go the way of the carrot. And he talks about in this, you're going to just have then extended war.
There is no other institution or organization on the earth that can bring these two sides together. No one else is talking to both sides but us. And no one else in the world can make something like this happen but the president. This is a very significant responsibility and a really important opportunity. And we want to make sure that we work it all the way through, that we don't walk away from something.
Correct. There is no one else trying to realistically find a peace. At the end of the day, what Europe has put forward, everyone knows that will never be accepted by the Russians. What China has put forward is just so much stress into the geopolitical environment moving into Europe as well. That's not going to be accepted by Zelensky. So America realistically is the one really trying to work here. And that's why there's so much friction between the Europeans and the Yanks.
That can actually work, or that can actually lead to peace. But we also don't want to continue to spend time on something that's not going to get us there. So throughout this process, it's about determining, do both sides really want...
So this idea of we're not going to waste our time on it, unless both sides really are serious about this, we're not going to continue wasting our time on it. Now, this is some political theatre as well, but the US has a lot of other things on their plate. There's a lot cooking in other places. And if Ukraine and Russia don't show that they're realistic about wanting to work through real politic to actually end the war and stuck in just ideals, America is going to take a step rearwards. But what I've said is, well, Putin has every incentive in the world to drag on this process that finally Trump has seen, because that benefits him. If America takes a step back, it impacts Ukraine significantly more. And I can't see a case where Trump turns around and goes that we are going to supply significantly more to Ukraine, because I think in his immediate team and his immediate supporters are going to be absolutely furious about that, especially as a lot of people are disappointed with how Trump's first part of his term is going. Now, let's look at Sergey Lavrov. Now, Lavrov is, of course, behind Putin, the most involved on the Russian side in these negotiations. And what I have said is Lavrov is a very, very dangerous negotiator, because he has been in this position for decades. A lot of the others have been in position for months. And as far as understanding the world order and being able to maneuver that world order, whether you agree with it or not, is irregardless of the competence to maneuver into a position where your world order has become the trajectory. Now, this Margaret Brennan for CBS has done an interview or Q&A with Sergey Lavrov. And let's look over this, because there's some bits and pieces in here we need to look at. And if you want to know what it feels like to have a brain tumor, this is it. Now, Russian Foreign Minister, then Sergey Lavrov. Good morning. I want to ask you what happened in Kyiv. There were a large attack on the capital city, 1 a.m. Trump has said publicly the Russian strikes are not necessary and bad timing. He said, Vladimir, stop. What made it worth killing civilians when Ukraine says it's ready for ceasefire? Lavrov responds here, we only target military goals or civilian sites used by the military. President Putin expressed this for so many times, and this is not different this time as well. We never consciously target civilian sites, unlike, he claims, the Zelensky regime. And she said, so it was an intentional attack then, not a mistake. And what I'll say, Margaret, is no, $1 million missiles are not fired by mistake and not at nothing of any importance, okay? It doesn't mean that things have gone wrong and have definitely gone wrong before, where there has been Civ targets hit and Civ CAS, but you don't in any case use an incredibly expensive and limited system to at least on your intel of nothing. I think a lot of the strikes we've seen has been very poor intel, rather than just trying to waste a missile to waste a missile. And Lavrov says, if this was a target used by the military, the commanders in the field had the right to attack them. And a lot of people do not understand what dual use actually is. Now, to be clear, when the President of the United States, Vladimir, stopped, is this a rejection of that request? Was the assessment that, because of what you were saying regarding that, concerns the loss of civilian life, made it worth it? Now, Lavrov said, I can assure you, the target attack was not something absolutely civilian like in the TV centre in Belgrade in 1999. We only target sites which are used by the military. Regarding the ceasefire and regarding the call to stop, Putin immediately supported Trump's proposal a few weeks ago for the 30-day ceasefire, provided we do not repeat mistakes of the last 10 years when deals were signed and Ukraine would violate those deals. We'll talk about more of that in a sec. But as far as these strikes, we can never assess these strikes beyond reasonable doubt for battle damage assessment. We never have enough to actually go beyond reasonable doubt. Was there a target in here? Especially when you look at the actual laws around dual use items where military is in areas too, and non-combatant casualty value rates as well. That all needs to be taken into account. Now, that is being taken into account from a legal sense, maybe not an ethical sense, but a legal sense there too. And if you want to see someone explain this or try and talk their way into this the best, look at any of the justification of Israeli strikes with NCV rates of 1 to 100 or 1 to 300. Now, this is an interesting part here. The fate of the deal on 14, the Minsk agreements, he says, which Ukraine violated, and that's why we just don't want another one of these. The basis of these proposals in Istanbul in 22, we know also fell apart. Now, neither side in this is completely innocent of these not working, but this is what Lavrov is saying. But Putin said, ceasefire, yes, but we want guarantees that ceasefire would not be used again to beef up the Ukrainian military, and the support of arms should stop. So, according to Mr. Lavrov here, he is saying, well, what was proposed, this 30-day, this ceasefire of unconditionality, that we would agree to this if it's just not used to beef up the Ukrainian military, then for the war to continue. And it's funny because this is where the retrograde ceasefire has done a complete 180. Russia has spoken about ceasefires previously in the years gone, and what Ukraine has said is any ceasefire would just be an opportunity for Russia to then re-equip, to use Lavrov's term, to beef up and start again. And Lavrov is saying, well, we'd agree to it if that doesn't take place. Of course, it's not like the factories in Russia are going to stop producing also, though. Now, this is where we get in this. Margaret says, Ukraine accepted on March 11 the idea of US brokered ceasefire without preconditions. You're saying the preconditions are negotiation to end something else. No, it's not a precondition. It is the lessons learned after other deals. But Russia has not accepted the call for ceasefire. He says, Ukrainian regime has strong support for European capitals and Biden administration. If you want a ceasefire just to continue to supply arms to Ukraine, what is your purpose? And, of course, referring to this beefing up. And that ceasefire, I see, if the ceasefire was in place, the war is going to start again unless it starts with some level of precondition. And Lavrov, she says, referring to then European Union and NATO, bluntly stated that they can support only the deal with which at the end of the day will make Ukraine stronger, would make Ukraine a victor. So this is the purpose of the ceasefire. And I don't think this is what President Trump wants. This is what Europeans, together with Zelensky, want to make out of President Trump's initiative. And this is the thing, the unconditional ceasefire. This is a political move to increase Ukraine's leverage whilst removing Russia's. And if Russia doesn't agree to this, then you can completely pin Russia being the party preventing peace. But the unconditional ceasefire, the unconditional nature of that, which I say nothing is unconditional, because the condition is there's no condition. I know as silly as that sounds, by making it unconditional, you are only stopping military action. Military is where Russia's leverage sits. Unconditional ceasefire, if you want unconditional in this, that would actually probably work, is for the next 30 days, it is unconditional, but it's unconditional on military actions, supply into the nation, and economically too. I don't know why Russia hasn't replied with, we'll have an unconditional military ceasefire if there's an unconditional withdrawal of all economic sanctions. Now, Europe is never going to agree to that, but where Europe's power is economic. Where Russia's is military. And in this unconditional ceasefire, which is military, the only leverage they're trying to take away is Russia's. And it's political theatre to try and say, well, it's them preventing this because in the act of presenting something they know they will never accept. And Russia can do the same back. They can agree and tag along with Trump knowing Ukraine will never accept that. Ms. Brennan says, but he did say that there was a deal. That, of course, there was a meeting with Putin in Friday with then Trump's special envoy, Mr. Witkoff. Lavrov, we continue our contacts with the American side. On the situation in Ukraine, there are several signs that we are moving in the right direction. First of all, because Trump is probably the only leader on earth who recognised the need to address the root cause, and that Trump sees that it was a mistake to pull Ukraine into NATO, and he wants to rectify this. And we have seen Trump say that Ukraine's not going to join NATO, and he has been in line with a lot of what Russia says the root cause of this is. And Brennan points out Ukraine is not part of NATO, but completely missing that for years and years and years it's been stated that Ukraine will be a part of NATO, and is looking for de facto NATO Article 5 style treatments in the European peace framework. Brennan points to, if Russia is not willing to make a deal about secondary, she calls them tariffs, but secondary sanctions on oil coming out of Russia. And what I will say is, this is not secondary sanctions. That's not how that works. It's not sanctioning the oil coming out of Russia. It's sanctioning the country that is using any Russian products. That's what makes it secondary, not primary. He says, I can't comment on what President Trump is thinking. Ms. Brennan again reiterates about secondary tariffs on oil. Lavrov says, we hear many things coming from President Trump, but he's sick and tired of the situation in this settlement and the continuation of the war Trump does not want. So I ask about the threat of sanctions or secondary tariffs, because you recently said in an interview, if you had to personally pick sides, you would keep the existing sanctions in place on Russia. You said you've reconstructed your economy to be self-sufficient, and there's growing fear, to quote you, cunning Americans will lift sanctions all of a sudden to flood our market with services and technology. So if that's the case, why should the US consider lifting sanctions at all? And what Lavrov was referring to is, because our markets have moved away and adapted, that if now the Americans lift all sanctions, a lot of our domestic stuff will really fall apart. And Lavrov says, well, why do you ask me? You just quoted my statement. She said, well, you want to keep sanctions in place? And he said, I don't want to re-explain what I explained. So basically saying, yes, I still agree with the quote that I made. Now, he says that I've read President Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and he does not advise to disclose information before it's time. And this is something we see with Lavrov throughout. This is not really wanting to get into the nitty-gritty. Brennan says respectfully, Trump speaks quite a lot about things he would like to do with Russia and opportunities to work together. And then they talk about the ZNPP, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And we have seen there's been a lot of different deals sort of going around of who actually will control this, and that Trump's public statement, the best security would be for the US and Ukraine to operate that together. Now, I believe she's incorrect on this. My reading was no, it would become a US plant and it would supply out to both Ukraine and Russia, and it would sit in a bit of a neutral zone from there. And Lavrov says this, no, we never received such an offer. And if we do, we will explain that the power station, the ZNPP, is run by the Russian Federation state called Rosatom. It is being under monitoring from the IAEA, so the International Atomic Energy Agency personnel permanently located on the site. And that no, this is not going back. She said, no, it's not conceivable, because that was a public statement. He says, well, we did not receive that proposal, which would be that specific, but journalists, you have to speculate. And she asks again, it's not being negotiated. He said, well, shall I say it for a third time? My tumour is growing. Final slide. He's asked, I haven't heard from you that Russia is willing to make concession on anything to date. And he says, no. My brief answer is that you are wrong. Well, what concessions has Russia offered? I've emphasised repeatedly in relation to Ukraine the relation to strategic relations with the US. I've been emphasising our readiness to seek a balance of interests. If this is not what your station considers readiness for negotiations, then I don't know how to be even less eloquent to trying to find my brief in my answers. Brown then speaks on things that Trump has said around business, and I don't discuss publicly the details of what is being subject to negotiations, and again reiterates that we are not discussing things which are subject to negotiations after we go back and forward multiple times. But it just gives us an idea of where then Russia's real lead man on these negotiations and Sergey Lavrov is sitting, and we won't talk about Zaporizhia. Crimea is done and dusted, and that things are being held close to the chest in respect also to not just speculate in the media, but that realistically where Russia is sitting, they're not looking to make any concessions on land or Ukraine joining NATO. And that's where I see all of that is just so far away from where Ukraine and Europe will sign something. And I think that we'll see the war march on. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.